Okay, again, good morning from Bonn. On behalf of the UNFCCC Secretariat, I would like to welcome you to the remote training on the full-length integration tool Flint. It's a global training which involves participants from all regions. Currently, I see more than 100 people connected, and we really appreciate and thank you for your interest in our capacity building activities. My name is Adin Gendeu. I'm Program Officer at the Secretariat in the GAG Support Unit. One of the main tasks of our unit is to support developing countries across all regions, Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean to establish sustainable GAG inventory management systems, including institutional, legal, and procedural arrangements, develop knowledge and build technical capacity, improve data quality in order to meet the reporting requirement with regard to GAG inventories for the MRV system and the ETF of the Paris Agreement. From the Secretariat, let me introduce Dominic Rivet, who is the team lead, Anna Pejovic, and Boris Ely. Later, I'll give the floor to colleagues from Moja Global to introduce themselves. For the moment, I would like to express our gratitude to colleagues from Moja Global for the technical work being implemented on the Flint and for the availability to deliver this important training. We also express our gratitude to the government of Canada for supporting this training. Later today, we will share with you the link to our website where you can find more information about our activities and also a link to a help desk that we recently launched to respond to all questions from developing countries about GAG inventories reporting requirement under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. And we strongly encourage you to make use of the help desk. We provide responses to questions very, very quickly. It's important to highlight that as part of our activities, we've been supporting the refinement of the Flint with the intention that it will help developing countries to meet their reporting requirements about the GAG inventories and the mitigation in the AFOLU sector under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. According to the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency framework for action and support referred to in Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, also known as MPDs, it's mandatory to submit a national inventory report either as a standalone document or together with the biennial transparency report that shall include, among others, GAG inventory for the AFOLU sector. AFOLU is a complex sector which involves many land use categories, complex carbon dynamics within and across carbon pools, biomass, dead organic matter in soil, and with the atmosphere leading to GAG emission removals. So as you can see, AFOLU requires a lot of data. And one of the major difficulties reported by almost all developing countries is the land representation and the detection of changes, conversion between land use categories. This is a major contributor to the uncertainty in AFOLU as reported by the countries. And the 2006 IPCC guidelines provide free approaches for land representation, and we hope that this training on the Flint will shed more light on the application in the context of the Paris Agreement of the approach free, which in principle generate more accurate data, especially on land area compared to approach 1 and approach 2. So colleagues from Moja Global will take you through the technical sessions of the agenda, and we at the Secretariat are here to support.
So this is the structure for the starting point. I'll do some introductions. Obviously, Sabine gave a fantastic introduction from the UNFCCC side. We'll talk a little bit about Moja Global, and I've just described the process we're looking at. As we put this workshop together, we were really thinking about what are the main things we wanted to get across. And it really wasn't just about, here's an interesting piece of software, because there's lots of interesting pieces of software in the world. What we wanted to try to focus on was the policy drivers and the things that push you towards using specific data sets or specific pieces of software in your country. And of course, that will change country by country. So at the end of this workshop, we would really like to people to have an increased understanding of things like the impact of the policy drivers on what your technical systems need to be able to do. So what drivers are actually pushing you that you need to meet, and what does the technical system need to output? We want to think about how we're going to design, build and run these systems. So moving very much towards operational frameworks that governments and countries can rely on day in, day out for producing accurate numbers. We want people to better understand how to engage with open source tools. Now, of course, Moja Global is an open source organisation, and the Full Lands integration tool is an open source tool itself, but there are many other fantastic open source tools. And engaging with those communities is really, really important if you want to get the best from them. We're going to go into different options for using the Flint, the Full Lands integration tool, as a basis for national reporting. There are multiple pathways for using it, depending on country circumstance again, and going into the data and model options that are available to countries. I've just run through this slide, so I will leave that for the time being. Just so everyone can get an idea, and if they see these faces coming up on their screen, they will, over the next 4 days, you can understand who you're talking to. We have 5 main presenters over the coming days. We're very fortunate for Dr. Werner Kurtz, who has stayed up till, or will be staying up well past midnight to assist here. He's been pivotal since the start of Moja and has over 30, probably 40 years now experience in forestry and carbon accounting. Myself, work in Moja Global. Andrew, who you will listen to on the technical steering committee, in particular on day 4. Julian, who is presenting on examples from Chile, and Anthony, who has developed some fantastic software, again with the support of Canada and with the UNFCCC, to actually take the vast amounts of data from something like the Flint and actually turn it into a useful system that you can then create reports and useful maps from. On the other side is the support team. These people will be dropping in and out at various times. They will be sitting here answering your questions as you go. So please, if you have a question, enter it. I realise that many of you are probably also from French-speaking nations. If you have questions in French, please enter them in French. Philip, when he is online, will be able to assist with that. He can also assist with German. And Werner can probably also help with those where needed. So please don't feel free as if you have to enter those questions in English. If you need to do it in a different language, please do. It would be remiss of me, as I pointed out at the start, to not thank everyone that has been involved in this process for the last 6 years of doing Moja Global. And as I said, it is a very large group of people that are starting to work on this in collaboration. The very first person I put up here is Guy Janssen. He has only just finished up as the head of the management board for Moja Global, but he was pivotal in setting up and establishing and running Moja Global for the past 5 years. Without Guy, this wouldn't have happened. But underneath that, you can see a huge list of mixes of commercial entities, foundations, government agencies, all coming together to try to develop a core tool. One of the most exciting ones on this that I think is going to be really important to think about for everyone on board is that we now have over 260 contributors to Flint and Moja. And these are people who are contributing their time and their code and their documentation and all types of support to try to drive this process forward. And that is a fantastic outcome that's really, really exciting going forward. And of course, finally, I have to thank the UNFCCC. They've obviously set up this workshop. They have done previous workshops with us, which have been highly successful. They have actively supported the development of the Flint tools financially, and they are actively supporting us to help develop case studies and applications. And their ability of the UNFCCC to reach out to so many countries, as we can obviously see on this call, is pivotal to the success of Moja. So, of course, we have to thank them very much. So I'm going to now just start off with day one and of what we wanted to talk about. And the main things we wanted to try to cover here were very much the policy drivers of why we're building these MRV systems. What's driving us to build something or actually use remote sensing or use some type of data that maybe 10 years ago we weren't really thinking about? Because it's not just a technical problem. The real problem for most of MRV that we see is actually around the policy issues. So we're going to run through a few of the technical aspects around TAC and the IPCC guidelines, some of the policy and reporting needs, and the types of system design and operation that you see. So many of you will be very familiar with this, so please, I hope it's not too simple, but we've just tried to summarize a few of these points up. So TAC, the TAC principles: transparency, accuracy, consistency, completeness, and comparability. These have been the core aspects of inventory, greenhouse gas inventory reviews for, I don't know, it must be at least 20 years, I'm assuming by now. They really do, they set out the framework for how to think about a system, how to implement a system, how to review a system. But there's a few key points we wanted to make in this part. So the first part is in transparency. And I wanted to make the point that transparency doesn't mean simple. Transparency means that the system is well understood, that the results are well documented, the system is well documented. It doesn't mean that a system has to be extremely simple. If the policy needs and the reporting needs, as we see, mean that a system has to be more sophisticated, that is absolutely fine. The system should, in the famous words of many scientists, I'm not sure who first penned them, it needs to be as simple as possible, but not more so. When we're looking at accuracy, we're looking at accuracy in the emissions and removals. So yes, we need accuracy in the components of doing our emissions and removals estimates, but the end piece is what is the accuracy in the emissions and removals we're looking at. We need to discuss consistency through time and space. We need to look at completeness in terms of the coverage, and we need to look at the comparability. And whilst not originally in red, that has stayed in the NDCs. Just a really quick comment on this. As many of you would be aware, in 2019, the IPCC guidelines were updated. These were an elaboration of core concepts, but the core concepts did not change. So whilst there were numerous changes through the guidelines, they remained highly consistent with 2006. And obviously in the negotiation, in the current negotiation process, the 2006 guidelines are the guidelines to be applied. The main differences, and we're very happy to discuss this as needed, are more around explaining the core concepts much more, especially around approaches and tiers, updating many of the emissions factors, really starting to address the use of remote sensing, which hadn't been addressed fully in 2006, more information on uncertainty analysis, and in particular, a new chapter on interannual variability, which Werner Kurtz is very well placed to discuss if anyone has any questions, as he was the lead author on that chapter. So the IPCC has two core concepts in it for emissions estimation. There are the tiers, and those tiers are, there's three of those: tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 1 are emissions factors or global defaults from the IPCC. They are likely biased for a country, but they certainly give you a result. And if you have no other information, then they are extremely useful. And you have to remember that even the most advanced countries often will still use tier 1 emissions factors or assumptions in some parts of their inventory. So it's not a sin to be using tier 1, but where a source or a sink is quite significant, then you really need to be using better data. From that point, you can move to tier 2 emissions factors. These are country specific, or they can be obviously subnational specific. You can have as many of these as you like. And the idea is at the country level, they should be unbiased and they should be far more accurate than a tier 1 emissions factor. And at the end, you come up with a tier 3 model or measurement system, which is much more advanced. It's generally more accurate and it's considerably more flexible. The key point with this to note, though, is that the tiers are actually based on the outputs, not on the inputs. So this is sometimes mistaken. So if a country has, for example, a national forest inventory and they use the data from that inventory, that does not necessarily make the system a tier 3 system. If you use that data to create emissions factors, it is tier 2. If you use that data to create models or use a measurement-based method, you are going to a tier 3. The approaches are 3 of those as well. I'll go through those in a bit more detail as we go through, because it's quite an important concept. The first one is approach 1, where you have no change information directly. You just have estimates for areas at different points in time. Approach 2 is where you can actually look at the changes between 2 periods. So you can see land uses moving between categories, but they don't track those categories through time. And approach 3 is where you have spatially explicit, as it's been known in the past, but realistically, the more important aspect of that is that it is temporally explicit. And by that, we mean it's actually tracking land units through time. And so you can tell if a land unit is changing land uses on multiple occasions. Approaches are based on the outputs as well, and not the inputs. So an example here is just because you have some maps does not mean that you are a spatially explicit approach 3 method. It is how you use those maps that determine the approach. As some very quick examples, here is the table, and these are directly from the IPCC guidelines. This is an example of approach 1, where you simply have time 1 and time 2. You have the area. The sum of the area obviously remains the same, but there are changes in those areas. So you can tell that in this case, forest land has gone up 1 and grassland has gone down 2, but you can't say where did that forest land go, or where did the grassland go and where did the forest land come from. So you're not tracking the land through time. Approach 2 is more sophisticated. And this is the traditional conversion matrix that I think many of you who have worked in the land sector will have seen before. And so what you have is an initial land use across the top, the final land use at the end of a year down the columns. And from there, you can see how much land stayed in a category and how much land moved between the different categories. The key point with the approach 2, though, is that you can't see if they have moved back. So, for example, if you had 5 hectares of the forest land that went to grassland, in this case you had 3, you can't then say how much of that maybe went back to forest land the next year. So it's a point in time change analysis that you're looking at when you look at approach 2. When you get to approach 3 is when you're starting to look at land uses through time. And so what we're looking at here in particular down the bottom is an example of this. You can see each one of these little squares is effectively a land unit, and that land unit is being tracked. And this is where a lot of the power of many of the new remote sensing methods can come in. So you can actually start to see, for example, in that 3rd row, you can see that it was forest. It was converted to a crop for a number of years, and then it was taken back to forest. And so you have different, those have moved categories, but it's the same land area that has moved. And that is a core concept that sits inside the IPCC approaches. One of the best parts of the new approach, the new 2019 elaboration, is that it does describe that in much more and much clearer detail than the 2006. A key point to remember is that the tiers and approaches are not mutually exclusive. So you can use any mix of tiers, you can use a mix of approaches, you can use those in different areas of the country, It really depends on the national circumstance and what you're trying to do. The key part of this is that it meets your needs and it meets what you actually are going to have to report on and at the accuracy level required. So it isn't that everything has to be at approach 3, tier 3. You can use different methods. And this was one of the core concepts when we designed the Flint. The idea for the Flint is that it can run all of these approaches and all of these tiers using a mix of data going through time. And the core concept behind this, as you see, and in particular we'll go into tomorrow, means that we can then have a core framework that you can build on over time. You can start simple and you can do these continuous improvement processes. You get better and better data. This is a really quick table, and I think it's one of the most important tables that came out of the elaboration, which really helps describe what we're talking about with approaches versus methods. So what you can see here, for example, in wall-to-wall methods down the bottom, is that you can have wall-to-wall maps, but those maps could be operating at approach 1, approach 2, or approach 3, depending on the quality of those maps and how those maps are being applied. And so I would recommend that everyone here who hasn't read that elaboration, go and have a really good look at it, because it's really important to understand those differences between those approaches. The other part of the IPCC that has been there for a very long time, obviously, is the carbon pools. And Sabine referred to the carbon pools previously. Now, this is a diagram directly out of the 2006 IPCC guidelines. It has been updated, but I like this one because it's nice and simple. And you can see here the 5 key carbon pools that are required for reporting under the IPCC, under the UNFCCC, sorry. You've got the above ground biomass, below ground biomass, litter, deadwood, and soil organic matter split into mineral and organic soils. There's also the harvested wood products pool. The key point I want to make here again is that these are high level pools for reporting, and we're going to get into this more. This is the highest level that we need to look at. So we've got all of those concepts in, but I think there are a couple of key points to please keep in mind over the next 4 days. The main one is that the guidelines are the foundation of a good inventory system and a good reporting system. They're not actually the building itself. You get to design the building. All you need to know is that the foundations that that building is sitting on are really, really solid, and the IPCC helps with that. The second point that I made earlier is the tiers and approaches are the results of decisions. They are not decisions in themselves. And you'll see this as we also go through further and further. And by that I mean you typically don't need to say, I need a tier 2 system. What you should probably be doing is saying, I need a system that meets these policy requirements, and because of that, effectively, I end up at a tier 2 system or a tier 3 system, or using approach 2 or approach 3. So it's really that decision process that we're going to go into in the next little section of this presentation. How you use the data in your system determines the tier and the approach, not the data itself. And that those tiers and approaches have a huge scale within them. And so that's why I put these 2 pictures on the side here. Both of these products here are approach 3, spatially explicit, available through time. Both meet the requirements for national reporting. One is using a Landsat image and one is using something at much higher resolution. Now, all this is saying is that you probably don't want to run the higher resolution because maybe that doesn't meet your ongoing costs and other requirements, and the lower resolution meets it. But they are still the same in terms of an approach if you were to describe what you were doing. The fourth point is that the IPCC carbon pools are a reporting category. You can have pools underneath these. And by that I mean, when I say the pools are underneath these, above ground biomass is also comprised of maybe the stem, the bark, and the leaves. the IP, and for reporting, you report up into that category, but that doesn't mean that your system should only report above ground biomass. If there is a need for additional pools to improve your estimates, then you should still be able to use those, and many countries do. So a very good example of this is that above ground biomass may be split into those pools I mentioned before, and that is important if you have big wildfires, because the wildfires will take off the leaves and the small branches and leave the rest of the tree. And so maybe you want to be able to estimate what the emissions were from those. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about this, but they are just a reporting category. Very important reporting category, but they are a reporting category, and you can have other pools underneath them. The land use categories are exactly the same. They are categorizations for sending, for reporting lands into. They are not categories to map to as such. And this has been a problem that we have seen a lot in the past of people trying to say map grasslands or map croplands. What you should be trying to do is map what the activities are and the land categorizations in your country. You can then use those to create the emissions estimates, and from those you can simply report into those IPCC categories. They are not a mapping category as such themselves. I'm very happy to describe that a bit more, but when you think about these as simply reporting, it does make life a lot easier. So I've got one question here which I'll answer very, very quickly. Around IPCC methodologies around comparing maps of many years difference. The smaller periods, the period between mapping will really depend on your national circumstances. And we will go into that a little bit more later. But if you have very large gaps between sample points or maps, you can actually miss very large amounts of emissions and removals because you're actually missing multiple changes through time. It's actually a really sort of great question. So now I'm going to go into some issues around system design and policy and reporting needs. And this is something that that is very near and dear to my and Werner's heart in particular. And we're really interested to get your thoughts on this part of the presentation. And I think it's really interesting at the moment because there are such a huge range of new challenges coming up for national systems. So it's not just about collating some data to send off to an agency to have some reports done anymore. The real drive is actually around how do we use this information in multiple ways, and a lot of that has come out of the Paris Agreement. So when you're thinking about designing your system for the land sector, it's not just about reporting, it's about how are you going to use this for your NDC development. And that could be, are we using it to estimate past emissions, to set baselines? Are we looking to do business as usual scenarios, for example, like many countries are looking at? How are you going to use this to track those commitments? So that's a very different question to just trying to produce a spreadsheet. You have the issues of MRV, then moving obviously to the enhanced transparency framework by the end of 2024, and a whole lot of the assessment processes that will be going through that under Paris. There's the mitigation planning, and of course, what's very popular and will be very interesting to see what happens in Glasgow will be around Article 6 and what might happen with the trading mechanisms. And if you're going to start looking at selling offsets or using some aspect of moving carbon as units, either within or between countries, then how does your system actually support that? That's a really big change from 10 years ago. And I think it's something that we really need to keep in mind, and it's one of the key reasons why we've been building the Flint. On top of that, the Paris Agreement, which I think is obviously the most important one, and that's why we're here with the UNFCCC, there's obviously lots of others in there. There's the New York Declaration around reforestation targets and restoration, and all of the work that's going on around that, which is very clearly linked to mitigation targets. But there's also many others. There's the Convention on Biological Diversity, combating desertification, United Nations Forum on Forest, and some other new things around the private sector reporting. So when you actually start writing down a lot of these needs, what you find is that you start coming up with a set of system requirements. So what does the system actually need to be able to do? What's its performance specification in many ways? And so here we've just tried to list down some of the examples of what we would see as key policy and reporting needs. They can be, how do you analyse the land sector for net zero? How do you think about natural climate solutions? How do you support financial or market access? How do you make sure you're covering all of your lands, all of your activities, all of your potential metrics? How are you balancing the accounts so that they can run from any form of project you may have and make sure that is consistent with your national accounts? All of these issues need to be considered when you're actually designing your system. The other side of it that I think is becoming far more interesting and far more challenging, especially as we start moving into the biennial update reports and the needs to really operationalise these systems. So rather than sort of 5-yearly reports being put out as part of, say, national communications, the time frame for those reports has come down significantly. And if you look at many of the policy and reporting needs, you probably need to be able to run this system far more frequently than just every 2 years, because it's going to become a core functioning aspect of your government. The operational needs are really interesting as well. So you need to think about the lifetime cost of operation. How do you actually cover that cost, and how do you keep those operational costs down? How do you design a system so that, yes, there may be some significant upfront costs, but the actual ongoing cost is much lower? How do you manage all of the access to all of the different data and results? How do you manage all of your data archiving? What's the auditing? What's the QA/QC? How do you manage all of your version control? How do you do your system documentation? How do you get to transparency? These are really, really big issues. It's not just about trying to pull some data together to get some emissions, some accurate emissions estimates. The third set on the side here of little icons that I've put on the side here actually are the other drivers that we're really starting to see come into this market. So it's not just countries demanding, and the UNFCCC really demanding this type of data. You're also starting to see it from the private sector, be it the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is also moving into the nature-based solutions now. We have science-based targets, we have sustainable development goals, we've got the Partnership for Carbon Accounting, and of course the CDP. These are also driving a lot of the needs to be far more specific. The general summary I would say here is that what all of this means, and it probably looks like a lot of information and it looks like a lot of things to cover, but the key point is that this is driving us from the need to have tools or just simple reports and actually create operational systems. And it's those operational systems that I really want to try to focus on over the next 2 to 3 days. So what I'd like to discuss now is very much how do we design a system. Now, this diagram here is a very simplified diagram of a system for estimating greenhouse gas emissions from the land sector. And what we have at the top is we have data coming in. So forest data, for example, that could be data from a national forest inventory, for example. You may have other data that could be forest type information or some other useful information, or it could be remote sensing data. Those data then get turned into products. Those products are then integrated, or they are put together. And by putting those together, you get out the information that you need at the end. Now, that is how you run a system. And that is a very efficient way of running a system once that system is in place. But when you are designing a system, the key point is that you actually need to come back the other way. And so hopefully this makes sense as to why I listed all of those things we need to think about on the previous slides. The challenge is to understand all of those needs, understand the integration piece, think about the products that we need to produce, understand those products, and then have the data providers produce those products. That way the data providers know what they need to produce, but more importantly, the team that needs to use the data knows what those products will be and how they are actually going to come together at the end. So the simple message here is that you design a system from information required back, you run a system from the data running down. And it's really important to get these interactions in the middle that are all of these arrows going the right way, so that you know that the products you are producing from your remote sensing information will be consistent with the products you're getting from your, say, forest inventory or your models or some other type of information. That way you can guarantee that consistency and keep that running through time. This is a very quick example diagram. There is a very simplified version of this in the Global Forest Observation Initiative Methods and Guidance document. But this really does help summarize how you may end up at some points for your data and your system. So I'm not going to run through this entire decision tree here, but what you can see, there's two key points that I'd like to make. The first one is that nowhere in this diagram do we use the word tiers or approaches. At the end, you end up with a system of a set of tiers or approach, but the actual driver of that tier and approach is the actual answers to the questions that we have here. So a very simple starting point is the land sector even important for your country? If the answer to that is no, then there's still another question. The question could be, do you need a more advanced system for other reasons? If it's not a key source of emissions, but you're interested in supporting farmers to reduce what little emissions they have, or you're looking at some form of trading mechanism, then you may still need a more sophisticated system. But if that's not the case, then you can very simply go down and run a very simple solution. As you start asking more and more questions, and as those questions get more and more complicated, then you end up with more and more sophisticated systems being designed. And so what I have built here as a flow diagram is effectively just these series of questions that run down the side. And once you answer these questions, you actually have the really good basis for a system. The word operational is really interesting in this space, and I think one of the most poorly understood words is operational. What do we even mean by operational? So we need to define it. Now, this is my definition of operational. I'm actually very happy to have other people have other definitions, and those who are on the call, if you have a definition of what you think is operational, then please put it into the chat area, because we're really, really interested in this space. This is what Moja is all about. It's getting these systems up and running. So when I define operational, I have defined it as this, that the system provides necessary information to those that need it, when it is needed, and to the standard that's needed. So in here, I have simply put in that we know that there's people that need information. We need to know what those are. We need to know how often they need it and when they need it. And those people who get the information need to know that it's met the required standards. A fairly simple definition, but again, very keen on feedback from everyone on this call. When I'm talking about information, I'm talking about UNFCCC reporting, but it may be much broader, as we mentioned before. Who needs it? Well, that's also a good question. Is it government? Is it landholders? Is it the private sector? What levels of government need it? When do they need it? Is it annual? Is it ad hoc? Is it going to be on demand? Is it that a government is going to say, we need an analysis on this within a week? And does your system need to be able to respond to those policy questions, for example? There's a very big difference between a system that runs every 2 years and a system that needs to be run within a month, for example. And the standards that are needed, that it needs to meet. The IPCC is obviously the most clear standard that needs to be met, but there are also potentially other requirements that could be set by markets, but could also be set by your own internal government requirements. So when I say operational, or when we say operational at the moment, this is the definition that we are thinking of in this space. So what is needed to be operational? So the very first point is, of course, what I have just been mentioning, is that it needs to meet all of the policy requirements and the reporting requirements. But more importantly, to be operational, there are other parts, and Sabine actually really touched on this earlier as something that we often gloss over in the MRV space. And I think the reason we gloss over it is because we really enjoy the technical work. We enjoy doing this really interesting science and analysis to get these numbers together. But when I think of operational as well, the key part that I think of is the governance and the institutional arrangements. These are absolutely core to ensuring that your inventory system is going to actually run. So those need to be sustainable, they need to be consistent, and they obviously need capacity. And that capacity is human capacity, it's also financial capacity. By addressing those problems, this is where systems become sustainable, and when systems become sustainable, they become operational. The huge challenge in this space is to really move from science to operation. There really is a lot of great science out there. There's a lot of great data. There's a lot of even better data coming down the pipeline. You only need to look at the volume of remote sensing information coming out these days to understand that it's very clear that the data is not becoming a problem. The challenge is going to be, how do we actually turn that data into information? So this is our perspective that we've seen for several years. And again, I would also be really interested in getting the views of others in the chat box around this, because especially around RED+, but also in other countries, the idea of a cyclical operational system has been left behind in many cases with a rush to meet policy and reporting tasks. So many countries, for example, have had to very quickly develop a FREL to submit under a UN process or for some other baseline. They may have had to get something done for, say, the World Bank. What this has meant is that in many cases, rather than the idea of a system, what we're seeing is MRV as a series of deliverables. So we need to produce an NDC. Okay, we finished that. Now we have to jump on to the next task, and the next task is to produce a FREL. But the problem there, of course, is that what you end up happening is you get lots of separate little work streams, many of which are inconsistent and many of which are not operational. And in an operational system, what this means is that you would have one system that is producing all of these results. And these are effectively the policy criteria that you're putting over the top of your one system. And this obviously has issues around how do you maintain it and how you maintain that capacity to run. It's really all about the people. And again, we're going to see that more and more as we talk about Moja Global and the number of people and the types of people that are involved. Even though the Flint is a piece of software, it's not just software people working on it. There are scientists, there are documenters, there are policy people, all of these are working on this. And this is the same for an inventory system. So the mantra that we would like to put here is that a technical program is still a program. And if you are to deliver a program, then you don't just need technical experts. So thinking about how you would build out your team and how you would build out a system that helps with managing programs and managing contracts. How do you manage the IT services? How do you manage all of the data coming in and out? How do you make sure that the policy people know what data they're getting and that the technical people know what data they're supposed to give and what experts you need in MRV? So it's really important to consider the people when we are looking at MRV systems. Over the next 5 or 6 slides, I'm going to go through an example of an operational MRV system as a cycle. Now, this is just an example, of course. The exact process will vary depending on the user and country, but the core concept remains the same. And we have said that there's an operational MRV system has 3 main components. The policy, which sets the needs, the timing, and all of the responsibilities. The governance, which manages the process and the system and provides all of the adequate resources to run that system. And then the technical side, the technical people that are actually producing the required outputs based on the policies. And for the next few diagrams, you will see we've put 3 colours there. So I hope not too many people are colourblind. I'm afraid the policy one is the top one, green, governance as purple, and technical as red. So as we said before, these MRV systems need to be considered as cyclical. It's a big cycle. So you need to look out beyond the near-term outputs and focus on that process of how do we get things from being a line to a report, from a line to another report, to being part of this operational circle that we've got here. In this example, we have 5 key milestones that are occurring. We have an annual planning process. So how do we actually have a plan of what we're going to do this year? How do we meet that plan? How do we get the new data and all of the existing data together to meet that plan? How do we run the system, calculate everything and run it? How do we submit our, say, inventory report in this case? And how do we deal with a UNFCCC review? This is going to happen every single year. Now, where these exactly occur or not is at different points. But what you can see here is that it just has to repeat year on year on year. When we actually break this circle up into what people are required where, so the policy being on the outside circle, the governance in the middle circle, and the technical people in the inside circle, what you can see is that there's only one circle in there from our perspective that goes around the entire annual process, and that circle is governance. All of these systems are going to require all 3 of those inputs, but the policy requirements and the technical guidance will be required at specific times. The governance is required at all times. And that good governance means that you're going to have very clear objectives, very well documented roles and responsibilities, and clear pathways for engaging all of the different parties that you're going to use. We can then make the diagram much more complicated. And of course, we could make it even more complicated if we wanted, but that's not the aim. The aim is to point out, here's all of these additional little processes that need to occur around those 5. So in each one of those 5 milestones that we have listed here, what we have is all of these other little processes that a system is going to have to do. So it could be third-party audits. In here you can see doing recalculations and analysis and comparisons. You can see stakeholder engagement. If you need to take the data out every single year to talk to stakeholders about what this data means. How and when do you do public data release of data? How do you do internal reviews? All of these things are part of this very large cycling process. At all of these points, you may need to run your system. So these little blue circular arrows we have in here are where you may be running your system multiple times. So you've got new data, you will likely need to run the system to test that new data and do your quality assurance and QA on that data. You obviously need to run the system to get results. You need to assess the uncertainty analysis. You need to actually be able to understand if the results changed from last year, why did those results change? Did those results change because you changed a data input, or did the results change because there was some form of activity? And so these processes will be being run, and you have your system operations spinning at all different points through this process. Now, this is a favourite slide of one of my colleagues who's hopefully on the call, Rob the Light, because we put this in here because those diagrams and all of this information that we have just thrown out there often looks really, really daunting, and it looks like a huge, impossible task that can't be done, and it gets very difficult to do. I think the key messages here are that it can be done. It has been done on numerous occasions before, both in carbon accounting, but also in other types of reporting systems. The secret is to get a really good plan in place. So to stop, not rush, stop and figure out the plan and the needs of the system. Take a breath and relax. Once you have a basic system in place, and then with a systematic improvement process, you actually now have a framework that every year is improving, rather than having a system or some spreadsheets that you quickly produce for something and then put away, and then another set of spreadsheets for something else and another set of spreadsheets. We've developed up a framework that allows you to analyse where the improvements need to be made, make those improvements, get the budget to make those improvements, all of those processes. It is very, very much like running a marathon. So whilst running a marathon is never going to be easy, once you actually have a base, you're actually going to be able to build on that, and you will be able to run faster and you will be able to run better. So it is very, very doable. And one of the big advantages I think that we have over the coming days for you to be able to ask questions is that you have people like Werner Kurtz and myself and others who've been through this process. We have experienced the stress, we have experienced the difficulty of actually building these, but at the end we did end up achieving it. Yes, we made a lot of mistakes. We're very keen to share those mistakes so that they're not made by others, but we also figured out how to run these processes very efficiently. And so that's definitely a key experience that we would like to share. The other point is that you don't have to do it all yourself. So you can use lots of different resources in different ways. And we are going to touch on this in day 3 in particular, where we look at the different ways that countries are using or have been using the Flint to date. And there are lots of different business models around both the Flint use, but also the data that you bring into it. The key point is that all of these resources are at your fingertips. So for an example, in Australia, when we built the system 20 odd years ago, the actual core team was very small. It was only about 6 people, but there were numerous contracts out to deliver all of the data. So the core 6 people were responsible for figuring out the policy needs, designing the integration framework, designing how everything would come together, and for managing the contracts to make sure that all of that data and information came in at the right time. And that suited Australia very, very well. But that is an Australia-specific example, and many other countries use different methods which are also highly effective. But there are a couple of other key points to make. The first one is don't use scientists to do repetitive work. And this has been a key lesson that we have found over and over again, is try to find the best and train the rest. Use the scientists to develop the best quality science, to develop the models, to do the field measurement campaigns, to analyse the data for you. But when it comes to repetitive work, be it producing time series remote sensing products, for example, just as a base system, then why not let a computer or some other group do that for you? So really try to use scientists for what they're best at and use, say, the private sector for other parts. The next point is to build relationships. And this is really important. And again, this is a key aspect of Moja Global, is building these long-term relationships. And that means inside your countries with the scientific community, with the policy community, but also externally. How do you build relationships with the people that are really going to help you as you start hitting problems in your system design? And how can you have someone that you can call up and say, oh, I've tried to implement the Flint in this way and it's not working. Well, that's the reason for having Flint. That's the reason for having Moja Global, is to have that capacity to have effectively a community of users that is always going to be able to help you through the process. In terms of fitting all of the resources into the system design, that's how you actually need it. How do you design a system to fit all these resources together and make sure that you can improve your processes? So that is very much a really set of key lessons that we have. The final slide that I'd like to stop on here before I give a short summary, and then also hand over to Werner or someone to see if there's any key questions we could answer before we look at an example tool based on the Flint, is that the role of Moja Global is to provide the software, tools, and know-how to facilitate the building of MRV systems. And we are looking to do that not just by providing open source software and tools, but by providing the community behind it to support them. And that is our role. I'm going to stop presenting there for a minute, just to see if Werner or anyone has picked up on some questions that they would like to answer from the chat area. I realise that this was a lot of information in a very short space of time. And after we've answered some of those questions, I am going to give a short live demonstration of the types of tools that you can use to support not just national reporting, but also, say, carbon markets and tree planting when you have a well-designed systematic system in the back end.